You may find the information in this tape disturbing to your peace of mind. You may deny what you see, or you may attempt to rationalize why the information conflicts with what you've been led to believe. One thing is almost certain. You will never look at the people running your government the same way again. You may even learn something about your own character. So proceed with caution, because the next 12 hours could be a turning point in your life. Perhaps you already suspect that something has gone wrong with your government. If so, you're not alone. This tape may help you to understand why. It has not, however, been produced to lead you into any specific course of action, but rather it has been produced to show you the facts so that you can make up your own mind. It is our hope that it will infuse you with the same burning desire for liberty that motivated the founding fathers of this nation when they wrote the Constitution, and that you will begin to learn the principles that were incorporated into that document, principles that seem to have been forgotten by most Americans. Indeed, most of the problems facing our nation today stem from the government's tendency to ignore them. As our elected officials dig us deeper into debt, and as crime continues to increase, and as our children's hope for the future all but vanishes, people like you are beginning to demand answers, and in turn, their search for a solution is leading them back to those principles. That's why the Save a Patriot Fellowship was formed, and that's what this tape is about. The purpose of this video series is to help you understand exactly what has happened to your country, and why, despite the promises of politicians, nothing ever really gets any better. If we want to solve the problems that confront us, we must first know what those problems are and why they exist. If we want viable alternatives, then we must learn to discern fact from fiction and to perceive the truth when it confronts us. If we want to pursue a proper course of action, then our decisions must be based on accurate information. If we lack sufficient knowledge, then we must be diligent in our efforts to become informed. We must come to understand once again that respect for rights to life and property are necessary prerequisites to freedom. It is our hope that this series of tapes will help you to more clearly recognize the problems that face our country, so that the solutions will be more evident. Only then can we make correct decisions, and only then can we pursue the actions that are necessary to restore this nation to its former greatness. We hope this will result in a more just society, and that it will restore the knowledge that was once the cornerstone of our freedom, not only for our children, but for our children's children. If you're up to the challenge, then we invite you to proceed.
The Lord God never intended for one man to dominate another. You can't find that anywhere in this Bible, His Word. In fact, from Genesis clear on through, you see that He intended all men to be free and equal. I think the most prevalent example of this is when the children of Israel left Egypt. The type of government that He gave them reflected this. Remember, Moses accepted the 10 Commandments, and they were the law for all of us to obey still today. The most perfect law known to man. And instead of a government being set up to rule the children of Israel, what was set up was judges. And the only form of government that was exercised was if the children of Israel would violate any of God's laws. And then they would be judged as to that infraction. And of course, we all know what happens when men are totally free. They prospered. And they really prospered. They became wealthy beyond all dreams. So what happens when men becomes wealthy? The same thing in any society. I think we've watched it in the last 90 years in this country. They want to shirk their responsibilities and enjoy their wealth. And that's exactly what happened with the children of Israel. They shirked their responsibilities and wanted to enjoy their wealth. So they asked Samuel to go to God and ask for a king. And of course we know what God told Samuel what would happen if the children of Israel got a king. He would take all their man-child. Their man-child would run in front of his chariot carrying his spears. He would take the tenth of their vineyards, of their olive gardens. He would take their female child. And they say, we don't care, give us a king anyway. Everybody else has a king and we want one too. Let the king take care of us. And we all saw how the king took care of them. We saw how the king used them. Well, you know, it's no different here. The same way. I think one of the biggest problems that we have here is lack of knowledge of not only God's law, but the law of this country. And that's the main problem that we have. The preachers who preach this book, in most cases within this country, do not even understand it when they equate it against our laws. They talk about, particularly around March through April, render unto Caesar that which is Caesar's, and pay tribute to who tribute is due. And hardly any of them that I know preach from Matthew 17, verses 24 through 27, which says, and when they came to Capernaum, they that received tribute money came to Peter and said, doth not your master pay tribute? He saith, yes. And when he was come into the house, Jesus prevented him, saying, what thinkest thou, Simon? Of whom do the kings of the earth take custom and tribute? Of their own children or of strangers? Peter saith unto him, of strangers. And Jesus saith unto him, then the children are free. Notwithstanding, lest we should offend them, go thou to the sea and cast a hook, and take up the first fish that cometh up, and when thou hast opened his mouth, thou shalt find a piece of money. That take and give unto them for me and thee. And what did Christ say in these 4 short verses? He said a lot. You know, let's look at what he said. He said that if the king doesn't take custom and tribute from his children, then what are the children? They're free. What did he mean by being free? Free from what? Free from taxation. If children are free, then they're free from taxation. Then he says, well, we don't want to offend these people. He says, so go down to the sea and cast the hook and bring up a fish and open his mouth and you'll find a piece of money. Give that to him. Did he say go to Judas, who was the treasurer of the apostles, and get it from his purse? No. He didn't say take it from my purse. No, he didn't say that either. He didn't say take it from Peter's purse. He says, no, go to the sea and take it from a fish. Well, I think that's very significant in what he was telling us. Because at that time, there was a pagan god called Dagon. And that god had a man's body and a fish head. And when his mouth was open, money would flow from his mouth. And I think Christ was telling us that such things as custom and tribute are really of Satan. That taxation to support governments that dominate you and are tyrannical are of Satan. Now, the founding fathers were very astute. They had to be. You know, they didn't have TVs, VCRs, movie houses, you know, recorders, radios. They didn't have all these things. In fact, you know, as travel was in those days, if they would go visit their neighbor, in most cases the neighbor might live 20 miles down the road, and that's a day's journey just to get there on a horse. I don't know if everybody ever rode a horse somewhere. One time, the church out the road out here, they had come the old-fashioned way Sunday. And my 2 sons and myself, we had horses, and we figured, well, we got plenty of time. We went down and we saddled up our horses, and by the time we got to church, it was letting out. See, you really don't realize how long it takes to get somewhere. You're used to jumping in your car and you're there in 5 or 10 minutes. You know, right here in Westminster, we had one battle during all the war between the states. In town, Jeb Stuart was on his way up to Gettysburg to meet Lee, and he was coming up old Route 32, which is the old Washington Road. And there was a doctor out the road who was making his rounds in a buggy. And he happened to see some of the scouts coming up the road in Confederate uniforms, if they were lucky enough to have uniforms. And he became all excited. He came into town. Well, the town was occupied by the Delaware Cavalry. And they were encamped up on top of the hill, which was called the Commons at the time, but is now Western Maryland University. And so he took his buggy and rushed up Main Street, up to the top of the hill to the Commons, to tell the Delaware Cavalry the Confederates are coming up the old Washington Road. I imagine it's about a mile's distance from there to where he spotted the Confederates. So anyway, the captain of the cavalry was in a bar on Main Street all drunk up at the time. So the lieutenant commanded the Delaware Cavalry, and they rushed on a charge there on down Main Street and turned down the Washington Road, and they ran headlong into Jeff Stuart's cavalry. Well, the battle lasted 5 minutes, and there was only one casualty. It was a lady who was in an outhouse, got hit by a stray bullet. Not seriously. And the Delaware Cavalry was captured. Now, some of the companions of the captain secreted him into a wagon and took him down to Reisterstown. And it's recorded it took them 8 hours to get him there. Now, if you drive to Reisterstown today, how long does it take, Frank?
About 10 minutes.
About 10 minutes. So that gives you an idea about the travel. You know, nothing changes in this world except two things: communication and transportation. Everything else remains the same. Everything. Nothing. That's barring nothing. So you have to understand that the framers, you know, if they went to visit their neighbor, they travel a full day in most cases. So they wouldn't come right back home again, you know. They would stay a couple days. Well, did you ever have guests stay over a day? Did you ever have a guest stay over 3 hours? Right? It could wear thin, couldn't it? Particularly if they were a bore. Right? Could wear very, very thin. Well, you see, in order to be invited back, you had to know something, because the only entertainment you had was one another. And you had to know something. So, I mean, they went out of their way to gain knowledge. Today, all we do is we sit there and become amused. You know, the word muse means nothing. You're just amused. You're not even a sponge. You just sit there and giggle or something and don't remember what it was. So, but they couldn't do that. They had to entertain one another. So they understood all these things. But you realize that to enter Princeton University at that time, one of the tests to be admitted there was you had to read a book written in Latin aloud in English. Today, they just pray that they can read. That's true. Today, they just pray that they can read. They've been so dumbed down. I mean, the founders, look, my hero of that period is Samuel Adams, the father of the American Revolution. He was admitted to Harvard at the age of 12. At the age of 12, he was admitted to Harvard. And that was common for them then. I mean, when they were teenagers, they were acting like men. You know, their lifespan wasn't that long. And look at us today. I mean, we ought to be ashamed of ourselves, even myself. And we ought to be ashamed of ourselves. But anyway, they were very astute. They understood these principles that are in the Bible. They understood what government should be. They understood God's intent for government. And they put this in the first document that separated the colonies from the mother country, England. Look what it says from the Declaration of Independence. When, in the course of human events, it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the political bands which have connected them with another, and to assume among the powers of the earth the separate and equal station to which the laws of nature and nature's God entitle them. A decent respect to the opinions of mankind requires that they should declare the causes which impel them to the separation. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. Now that's God's plan in one paragraph for mankind. I mean, this man was brilliant. Thomas Jefferson was brilliant when he wrote that. That is God's plan for mankind in one paragraph. It couldn't be any clearer. They actually knew what they were talking about, and they wanted us to be free in every sense of the word. And they fully understood Matthew 17, 24 through 27. Now, that's what we're going to labor to do. We're going to talk about taxes tonight. I'm going to show you a book which was a textbook used in Baltimore County back in the 50s. The book was written in 1952. It's called Your Rugged Constitution. As you can see, it was the most popular book in the library at the school. They couldn't keep it on the shelf. That's exactly why we're so astute about the rules in which we live by, right? Is the Constitution the rules in which we live by? Well, how can you play the game of life if you don't know the rules? You don't play it at all. You fumble through, right? It's like the blind leading the blind. That's why we're falling into what? A big hole. And we're really falling into a hole for that very reason. Good Lord, I remember Brother Ed Ellison came in here one night to lecture. He lectures here some nights, and he came in here with a recording of one of our Congress women now presiding in Congress, Helen Bentley, who is now running for governor of the state of Maryland, and he played her reciting the Pledge of Allegiance to the flag, and she couldn't even recite it. She didn't even know the Pledge of Allegiance. She was stumbling all over herself on the radio live. Could hardly believe it. But man, she's fast to come out with pork barrel to keep her person in office. She's fast with the pork barrel of her electorate to buy votes. They used to call that what? The Founding Fathers called that cronyism. That's what they wanted to do away with, was cronyism. You know, but she's fast on that. Now, I understand now it's starting to come out that she's being revealed, some of her votes on some of these banking laws and all, and they're not so great. Everybody thought she was the champion of the people. But anyway, in here we're going to show you the parts of the Constitution relating to federal taxation, and they're found in Article 1, Section 2, Clause 3, right up front in the Constitution. And it says, representatives and direct taxes shall be apportioned among all the citizens of the United States. Right? Huh? Huh? Doesn't that say representatives and direct taxes shall be apportioned among all the citizens of the United States? Huh? Oh, wait a minute. Representatives and direct taxes shall be apportioned among the several states. Oh, I see. Well, what does that mean? Huh? What does that mean? Anybody know what that means? Doesn't that mean that direct taxes are apportioned to who? How does a direct tax come to be? Anybody know how a direct tax comes to be? Does the IRS just send out a bill to everybody and say, you owe this amount of money? Does the IRS send a bill to every state saying you owe this amount of money? Does the IRS collect direct taxes? There's a lot of questions there, isn't it? Well, how are direct taxes collected? How do they arise? Has anybody ever heard about the constitutional amendment to balance the budget? You think it's needed? Why isn't it needed? It's right here, isn't it? This is the amendment, not even an amendment, it's in the Constitution. This is the provision to balance the budget right here. That was the purpose of this Article 1, Section 2, Clause 3, was that if the Congress can borrow money on the credit of the United States for emergencies, we have a war, and there's not enough money in the Treasury to arm the populace or to build war equipment, then what they do is they borrow on the credit of the United States. When the war is over, then the total amount of debt that was accumulated for the emergency is, by an act of Congress, apportioned to the several states. And then the several states collect the tax and they send it to the Treasury of the United States so that they can pay the debt. And we're to stay debt-free. Right? That's what the founders wanted us to be, debt-free, to be free. And that's exactly why that's there. Can anybody tell me how many times that was done in the United States? How many times was this provision of the Constitution exercised? Does anybody know?
5 times. 5 times.
5 times, that's correct. 5 times. Any time in this century. Any time in this century. No. No.
Direct taxation.
Direct taxation.
5 times.
5 times. And it's never been assessed in this century.
So it's never been an ongoing thing, it's always just been a...
Well, it can't be ongoing because of the nature of it. First of all, there has to be a sum certain. That's the total of the debt, whatever it is. Then they take that sum certain and they divide it into the states, apportion it by the numbers of the states that are in the states. Right? Well, let's say they did this 5 times in 10 years. Let's say they have 5 direct taxes in 10 years. Would the direct tax be the same apportioned to the states, or would it change every time they assessed it? It would change? Would it change? If it was assessed 5 times in 10 years.
You're asking, you're asking.
No. All right.
If the debt were the same,
Well, if it would be apportioned the same.
No, but I'm saying if each one of those
If the same amount was assessed 5 times in 10 years, would it be the same?
Yeah,
That's correct. Why is that?
because the census is taken once every 10 years.
Right? Because of Article 1, Section 9, Clause 4, which says what? No capitation or other direct tax shall be laid unless in proportion to the census enumeration here before directed to be taken. And that's taken every 10 years, right? Okay? So it would be the same if it was 5 times in 10 years. Okay? Okie doke. So now we understand. So they have the total, Congress passes it, they divide it up, apportion it to the states. They actually use what to figure it? They use the House of Representatives. That's what they use because the House of Representatives would change every 10 years. See, every 10 years, if they take a census, that's when you read and you hear it in the media and read in the paper where they're redistricting the congressional districts. That's because the population of this country shifts and they move around, and that means that, of course, some states gain representation and other states lose representation. Here lately, there's been a movement from people who move from New England to the South. And you know what they call them? We have some Southerners here. They understand what I'm saying. Can anybody tell me the difference between a Yankee and a damn Yankee? Sally, you know the difference?
A Yankee visits, a damn Yankee stays.
That's right. That's correct. A Yankee visits and a damn Yankee stays. That's correct. So the population shifts, you see. And of course, that means everything else changes. All right. So now we understand direct taxes, right? They have to be apportioned to the states. The states collect them, and then they pay the Treasury, and the Treasury pays the debt. And the country stays debt-free. That's the plan that the founders gave us. All right, now, can anybody tell me the 5 times that the direct tax was apportioned to the states, who did the states collect it from? Did they collect it from every citizen in the states? But of course, every citizen's head was counted, wasn't it? So did they collect from every citizen if their head was counted?
They collected it from the people that own property?
Well, that's right. Why is that, Frank?
Well, because they were the ones to really vote. The ones that didn't own property couldn't really vote.
Well, I don't know about that. Why did they collect it? What does the vote have to do with the taxes? Was there a poll tax? Yes?
At that time, that's the only tax we had,
Was property tax.
property tax.
In fact, in the state of Maryland, it's the only tax we still have by the Constitution. A local talk show host, Zoe Hieronymus, is going to have all the major candidates on August the 24th of '94, a few days from now. And I don't know if I can be there because I have some court cases to prepare for. But I told Brother Ed we should ask the candidates if they're elected, do they intend to enforce the law as it's written? Right? And of course they'll have to say yes. And I said, well, then the next logical question to ask these people from Maryland, particularly the gubernatorial candidates, well then, if it was placed on the ballot in 1937 that the state of Maryland wanted to allow an income tax within the state with a constitutional amendment to allow this, and the people voted it down, and it's never been on the ballot again, where does the authorization for the tax? Would you please tell me? Do you, in fact, going to investigate this and enforce the law as it's written? I think it's a good question, don't you? How come they're collecting what they call a state income tax if the people said they didn't want it and it's never been on the ballot again? I think that's a very interesting question. Some of these other states, I think you'll find the same thing if you dig back in the history of them. You got to dig back a little bit and you'll find these things out. All right, so everybody understands now that it was collected at that time for property owners because they were the only ones that paid tax. There was only a property tax. And that's why they were the only ones who had the right to vote at the time. The principle being, if you paid the tax, you had a right to vote. If you didn't pay the tax, then you shouldn't vote the man who paid the tax off his property. And they figured if everybody was given the right to vote, that's exactly what would happen, because they would vote in every pork barrel project there was. If you don't have to pay for it, it's easy to spend somebody else's money. I mean, when they did change the votes for everybody, what happened?
Just what you said.
Exactly what the founders said has happened, right? All these pork barrel projects have now, the government now calls them entitlements. That's what they're called, entitlements. And the entitlements are almost the total budget. I mean, they're just about the total debt. That's what's running us into the hole. are these entitlements. All right, so that's direct taxation. Now, how many categories of federal taxation are there? Anybody know? Two types of categories, right? You have direct, which we just reviewed, which is a portion to the states, and you have another type, which is found in Article 1, Section 8, Clause 1. And that is, Congress shall have power. Now notice before 1, 2, 3 didn't start out that way, did it? It said direct taxes shall be apportioned. It didn't say that Congress had power to collect anything, did it? No, because the states had to collect it. But this one starts out, Congress shall have power to lay and collect taxes, duties, imposts, and excises, to pay the debts, provide for the common defense, and general welfare of the United States. But all duties, imposts, and excises shall be uniform throughout the United States. So direct taxes are apportioned, and indirect taxes are what? They're uniform throughout the United States. All right, is this an indirect tax? Well, it doesn't say indirect, does it? No. The way we get the word from indirect was that when the court started making rulings, the Supreme Court that is, started making rulings regarding Article 1, Section 8, Clause 1, they called it an indirect tax. In fact, the Founding Fathers called it an indirect tax in the Federalist Papers. Everybody know what the Federalist Papers are? Anybody here doesn't know what the Federalist Papers are? Everybody knows what the Federalist Papers are. Boy, we've got a good class here tonight. Everybody knows. All right? Because Alexander Hamilton called them indirect taxes in the Federalist Papers. So they're indirect in nature that the government cannot directly tax anyone. The reason for that is they just got rid of a king, and they didn't want the federal government to become an emperor, an empire. You know, Madison wrote that a dictator or an emperor, he doesn't have to be one person, it could be 13, he said. Right? It doesn't necessarily have to be one, it can be a whole Congress can be a dictator. And they realized this. So they didn't want to give them any power over the people. They wanted the states to be a buffer between the federal government and the people. That's why the term states' rights came into effect. All right? So we have duties, imposts, and excises. Now we know what duties and imposts are. They're connected with what? Shipping and importation of commodities and goods from foreign countries, right? And their ships docking up and paying fees at the customs fees at the wharfs. What are excise taxes?
Taxes on automobile cars in this case.
Luxury. Well, it could be. But what is actually an excise tax? Mm-hmm.
That's a tax that's uniform throughout the United States.
Well, it's uniform, but what is it?
For instance, if you put a tax on automobile cars of $2 in Maryland, it must be throughout the United States.
Well, that's the uniformity of it.
Right.
But what is an excise tax?
Tax on commodity. Luxury tax.
Well, it could be.
Commodities?
It could be. That's right. Commodities. What else? What is an excise tax?
Tax on consumption.
Consumption? Well, the Supreme Court said in 1909, said an excise tax is a tax on the manufacture, sale, and consumption of a commodity within the country on corporate privileges and certain privileged occupations. So an excise tax is a tax on the manufacture, sale, and consumption of commodities, right, on corporate privileges and certain privileged occupations. Well, what is a corporate privilege? You notice all this has something in common except the tax on commodities, right? The excise tax on commodities is an outright manufacturer's tax. Probably we would have never had a tax except for Alexander Hamilton. Everybody knows about Alexander Hamilton. He was a monarchist, believe it or not. A lot of people don't realize that. But he was a real elitist. He didn't believe that the average person could govern himself. He believed in monarchies. In fact, he was a staff officer for George Washington during the Revolution. And as soon as the war was over, and just before Washington was to travel to Annapolis, Maryland, which was then the capital of the United States, to resign his commission, all his staff officers threw him a party. And he went to this party, and at the party, Hamilton had already organized them, and they asked him to be the first king of the United States. And Washington answered and said, you know, if he hadn't been a man of such high morals and principles, we would have probably had a kingdom or a monarchy here today. But Washington said to them, he says, there is but one king in the universe, and it is not I, but Jesus Christ. And he told them to go in peace. He would hold them, nothing against them. And after the party, he traveled to Annapolis and resigned his commission. And the army was disbanded. Why was the army disbanded? Because we're not to have any standing armies according to the Constitution. Well, why is that? Because a standing army can act by a tyrant to a tyrant. That's right. Everybody understand that? So we're not to have standing armies according to the Constitution. According to the framers. That's what they see. Well, what we're to have is a military academy and enough military force to keep up our bases, and that's it. But nothing beyond that. The framers said that if we keep our nose out of foreign affairs, we won't need a standing army. I mean, if anybody reads George Washington's farewell address, that's what he said. If we just keep our nose out of foreign affairs, mind our own business, people say, oh, you can't do that. How can you do that? Well, ask Switzerland how you do that. Right? During World War II, I mean, German and American officers used to meet and drink together in Switzerland, then go back and fight one another. The First World War and the Second World War. Isn't that interesting? Wild, I'll tell you. Smedley Butler, right, he was a general in the Marine Corps, and he wrote a little book about war. He went through a lot of different wars, and he says wars are for nothing but to enrich the wealthy. And if he had his time to go over again, he would never participate in any of these wars. According to him, we haven't had a war in the interests of the country since 1812. And it's true. That was the last war that was needed, was 1812. The rest of them were contrived by those wealthy persons that Jefferson kept talking about. If you didn't curtail them every 20 years, you'd have to have a revolt against them. And he was correct too, wasn't he? I mean, these men were brilliant. But anyway, back to taxation. So we have excises. Now, what is a corporate privilege? Cheating your neighbor. Well, isn't that right? A corporate privilege is cheating your neighbor. That's what government calls having a privilege from them, where you can cheat someone. The government will give you that privilege and tax you. They can make money off of it. Anybody thinks that government fights crime, they got to be crazy. Government thrives off crime. That's why they keep turning them out. That's why they encourage them to commit crime. Because that's how bureaucracies grow. Right? So people are encouraged along these lines. So it means cheating your neighbor. It's a limited liability, where you're not liable for all the debts. You put everything in the corporation and you help yourself, you save yourself. I mean, there's a lot of people that use this in a terrible way. They'll run up all kinds of bills and defunct that corporation, start another one, and keep setting up holding companies and just cheat people over and over again. And they get away with it. What's another privilege? What's a privileged occupation?
Lawyer.
Lawyer, that's right, a lawyer. Why is a lawyer a privileged occupation?
Couldn't exist without the government.
That's right. There are without courts, there are no lawyers, right? So a lawyer is privileged because of courts. That's why a lawyer pays a tax. It's for his license. That fee he pays is a tax. Well, what about a doctor? Is that privileged? No, well, a doctor has a license, don't he? A lawyer has a license, a doctor has a license, so is a doctor privileged?
No, the doctor has a license to prove that he can do the job he's doing.
Oh, he has a regulatory license. It's not a privilege license to cheat your neighbor like the lawyer. Right? He has a license so that people know he knows what he's doing. Supposedly. Right. Okay. So we understand that excise taxes are in the manufacture and sale and consumption of a commodity and corporate privileges. And like I said, Alexander Hamilton wanted to show that the federal government could tax, and he convinced the administration to lay a tax on whiskey just to show that the federal government had the power to tax the citizens in some way, and he caused the whiskey rebellion, which Washington had to go up there and suppress. And ever since then, they have never suppressed it. I mean, my grandfather, he was a lieutenant detective in Baltimore, and I was a little boy, and there was a terrible murderer who had escaped the prisons at that time when he was on the police force back in the early 30s, called Jack Hart. And he escaped from prison here, and he went to Tennessee, and he was up in the mountains. And my grandfather had the job to go down and retrieve him. And he says it was nasty. He says because people might think you're a revenuer, and revenuers didn't come out. In those days, I mean, revenuers went in, and that was the end of them. They didn't venture in there. I mean, that was from the Whiskey Rebellion in the 1700s. It's still going on. I mean, what does that show? That you cannot kill the spirit of freedom, can you? Right? No matter if you think whiskey's good or not, it doesn't matter. That's not the point. Right? And the government calls them sin taxes. Sin, we can tax the daylights out of sin because the population can't agree that we shouldn't. Right? So, I mean, they can get by with that, and they do. All right. Now we understand there are two types of taxes, right? Indirect and direct. And we know that the indirect tax is uniform throughout the United States, correct? If I pay for tax on an automobile tire of $10 in California, it's going to cost $10 in the state of Maryland, right? No matter where you are, you're going to pay whatever it's on. Okay, now, also, in this textbook, they gave the children illustrations, such as this one right here is for Article 1, Section 8, Clause 1. It says, Congress may use its taxing powers to get money, to pay the debts, provide for the common defense, and general welfare of the United States. Now look how they depict general welfare here. Right, you see it? Yeah, they depict, promoting what? Commerce. Canals, waterways, dredging the harbors, the shipping can come in. Because when you do those things, what do? Everybody benefits. It's for the general welfare of the whole country. Because everybody benefits from commerce, right? We can't live without commerce. I mean, that's our marketplace. Now, this is, remember I told you this book was published in 1952. Now, today, if they publish this book, of course, we all know they don't publish any of them for school books in the Constitution now, but if they did, what do you think would be pictured here when talking about general welfare? Well, I think it would be a large building in a city with a long line going in one door and coming out the other door with a check in their hand. And then around the corner there would be another door going in where those who just lost that check could go back and get another one. Now, you might think I'm being silly when I say that, but I'm not. In 1968, I had a business partner whose wife worked for the Department of Welfare in Baltimore. And that was her job. All she did all day was issue a second check to everybody who come in and said they lost the first one with no questions asked. That shows you how things get out of hand when the government runs it. And it wasn't long after that when they came and it started coming out in the media where there was all kinds of fraud, where people living in North Carolina was traveling to Maryland and they had a phony address in Maryland and they were coming up here getting all kinds of groceries and checks and everything, going back to North Carolina, come up once a month on a regular trip. So when you have government involved in things, what do you have when you have government bureaucracies? You have corruption. I don't care what it is. You know, when I was a builder, they had zoning. And all these inspectors, these zoning inspectors and building inspectors, what did we have? We had corruption. They always had their hand out. Always had their hand out. And of course, oh no, it's for the public safety. I can go around here and show you places around here, the public safety where the septic system shouldn't have been passed. There was springs running through them. And for a $100 bill and a bottle of whiskey, there's a septic system there. Of course, we're going to protect the public, you know. Yeah, the only thing that protects is those who are in power in their cronies' pocketbook to expand it. That's when they get all these special zoning privileges where they can do something and you can't. Zoning is for the privileged few. And they give you, you know, we didn't have any zoning in this country before 1926. People don't realize that. 1926, there was no zoning before that. And we had some judge made a ruling saying, well, in fact, the case says very clearly where the judge says, well, I don't see what harm he could do. That's what he didn't say whether it was constitutional or not to control somebody's property, to diminish its value or raise the value of your neighbor where there's no equal protection of the law. Oh, no, he didn't say that. He said, I can't see where it would do any harm. And then all these other black-robed, and you know, there was a guy who started a committee, and he published some letterheads for his committee. He printed up some letterheads for his committee, and it was called the Committee to Prevent Judges from Being Hung Even Though They Deserve It. and the letterhead had a large watermark, you know, you've seen these watermarks, of a judge hanging from a tree with his neck all twisted. And he used to do letters and send these out to the courts, you know. I bet you they really love that. But it's true. It's totally true. There's very few honest judges in this country. And I think history bears that judges tend to be corrupt. I don't care if you look back in the Bible, what do you see? Judges tend to be corrupt. And they are. There's a lot of temptation there, and most of them are political animals anyway, and they just take it.
John?
Yes.
May we go back to that last overhead for just a moment?
Sure.
What we're seeing there is what they're showing on this overhead right here. Is that the total scope of the power that Congress
Article 1,
has
Section 8, that's right.
Is that the total scope of what
That's
they
right.
have the right to collect for? The
To
common
pay the
defense?
debts, provide for the common defense and general welfare.
Well, I asked that because nothing there would refer to anything like foreign aid or Social Security or even flood relief for flood victims.
No, because what would that do if you had flood relief or Social Security? If that was imposed by the Constitution, what would happen?
Well, I can see that it would benefit a selected group and not.
Well, yeah, but what would actually happen if that was in the Constitution? Anybody know? No, what would happen if those things were in the Constitution, they were allowed in the Constitution? What would happen? There would be no law. There would be no law, right? So if the 14th Amendment says all citizens have equal protection of the law, and you're giving some citizens money, not others, or giving them flood relief, not others, right? Or if the law says that no man shall be deprived of property without just compensation, which is in the 5th Amendment, right? The law is void when it conflicts. There is no law. Law cannot conflict. So it just stands to reason. I mean, all you got to do is look at the Constitution. If they act outside of any of these three things, which you're right, you're totally correct. This is the scope of the Constitution. Because what does it say in the Declaration of Independence? What does it say there? And the pursuit of happiness. Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness is the only just function of government. That's it. When I entered the police academy in Baltimore in 1957, that's what they used to teach us. They taught us the only lawful function of government was protection of life and property. That's why when we worked 12 to 8 shift, we had to go around and try everybody's doorknob. It was a commercial place. We had to protect their property. So we had to make sure it's locked. We had to go around and do that. If somebody, we were taught that we couldn't go into somebody's property without a warrant. But if we heard somebody in there hollering, "Help, murder, police," and screaming, then we had reason to believe somebody's life was in danger. We could go through the door. They taught us all these things. I don't know what they teach them today. I really don't. I think the only thing they teach them today is everybody gets on the road and tries to get revenue by pulling people over who are going a few miles over the speed limit. I think everything evolves around revenue today. When a country becomes corrupt, that's what happens. I mean, that's what Christ was talking about when he talked to Peter. Those who collected at your master pay tribute. Everything at that time evolved around revenue. And we'll understand that clearer a little later on. But you're totally correct. That's life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness right there in those illustrations. Now, what we have here is a related subject to taxes, which is called money. We find in Article 1, Section 8, Clause 5, the Congress shall have power to coin money, regulate the value thereof, and of foreign coin. Now, over on the other side, there's an illustration showing the children how Congress does this. It says, you give to Congress permission to turn out money. See what they show them? Now, we got some printing presses back here. And for years we've been trying to get these coins out of there. I don't know how they did it. I really don't know how they did it. Because over here it says both coins and bills and how to decide how much it's worth, but over here I can't find the word bills. Anybody see it? Is there a difference between a coin and a bill? What's the difference between a coin and a bill?
One's paper, the other one's not.
Well, what's the main difference between coins and bills? Huh?
One's supposed to have intrinsic value, the other one has not.
The other, oh, wait a minute. The other has something.
It's supposed to represent intrinsic.
No, the other one has something. The coin has an intrinsic value, a value within itself. What does the bill have?
Debt.
A debt. There's a big difference, right? One's worth something, and the other one is you wish you never had. Right? Is your debt. So there's a big difference, and they said you tell Congress to do both. To coin on one hand and go into debt on the other. Now, I can't find that anywhere. You know, they wonder why the children don't know what's going on. And I mean, good gracious, when the teachers use books like this that shows direct confliction from one page to the other, and they're teaching it, I think that's pretty bad. No wonder we're in such bad shape. And you know, most people don't even question these things. Don't even question them. Now look down at the bottom here. It says, and fixed standards of weights and measures. Well, it stands to reason, if Congress fixes the standards of weights and measures, they tell you what a gallon is, right? Now, our gallon is different from the English gallon, right? The English gallon is called an imperial gallon. Our gallon is called a gallon, a U.S. gallon. Imperial gallon has more content, volume, than a U.S. gallon. Now, also, the coins. The value of the coin is what?
It's weight, right?
It's weight. How many ounces or whatever, how many pounds, if it may be, of gold or silver is in that coin. That's the value of it. So Congress sets the standards of the value of that weight when they strike it into a coin. All right, now, it says standards of weights and measures, and up here it says regulate the value thereof in a foreign coin, right? Why does it say foreign coin?
Well, they used to pay us in foreign coins mostly through shipping and all.
You think?
They used to.
Sally?
I think England was restricting the colonies from producing their own money, so as a result they had to use another currency, which was the Spanish dollar.
There were no colonial coins issued by the federal government. This is after England now. This is the Constitution. The Constitution was well after the Revolution. See, the Revolution was over what year? That's right. The Constitution was what year? 87. Ratified 89. You're correct, but the convention was 87 and ratified 89. So when they drew this up, it was 87. England was separated. Well, why did they say that?
They were still using the coin.
Because we were only using foreign coins. There were no U.S. coins. When was the first U.S. coin struck? When was the first U.S. coin struck?
1793.
Was it 93?
Mortgage Act was 1792.
July of 1792. So it was sometime thereafter. Right, right. So how were the coins struck? Did the government go to the Treasury? Did the government go to the Treasury and take some gold out and melt it down, and some silver and melt it down and strike these coins? Well, doesn't everything come from the government? Huh? That's what I thought. I mean, I listen to these politicians and these newscasters today, and they tell me everything comes from the government. Right? Well, how were the first coins struck?
People melted down their own personal.
That's right. Martha Washington had a first coin struck. She took her silver set and they melted it down and struck her some silver coins. Right? So all the silver and gold came from where? From the population, the people. Now, they didn't have any because they were operating on what? Continentals, right? And everybody knows it ain't worth a continental. Now we know what that means, right? All right? So now, how do you tell the difference between a continental and a dollar? Where did the term dollar come from? Huh?
Spanish mill dollar.
That's Spanish mill dollar, that's right. The name of our money came from a Spanish coin called the Spanish mill dollar. The reason why it did, because the dollar was the standard for money in the world at that time. It said milled. Milled means it had a serrated edge, where if you got the coin, you could run your finger around it and you knew all the weight was there. See, in the days when everybody used coins, they had what they called coin clippers. People would receive a coin and they would shave a little off where they passed it on. Right? Then they could take out little shavings after a while and take it up and have it struck into a coin. So when the Spanish mill dollar come out, you knew nobody shaved it and you had all your coin there. So it became the standard of money for the world. We need a standard like that today, don't we? Right? To show that all the weight is there, honest weight. What the Bible says about honest weights and measures, congressmen ought to know about that. But any which way, so how in the world did they equate to fix the standard of weights between a Spanish milled dollar or an American dollar and a continental or a United States note or a Federal Reserve note?
Ain't no way they could do it.
Huh?
Ain't no way you could do it, right? Because it's dollar.
Well, how do you set the standards of weights and measures on a piece of paper money? Huh? Can you set this? Well, can you set it between a 5 and a 10? Huh? Of course. You have an extra digit, right? So that has to take more ink, right? All right. Now, can anybody tell me, what about these, what they call minor coins? What are minor coins? Base metal, that's correct. Minor coins are made of base metal, which are what? Copper, nickel, right? Zinc, right? That's what they call minor coins. Well, can you pay a debt with minor coins? Right. According to law, you can't pay a debt over $25 in minor coins. So, but you can pay, but up to $25. All right, that's in Title 31, United States Code, if somebody wants to go look it up, and you'll find that, okay? So we see Congress sets a standard of weights and measures, and they coin money and regulate the value thereof. Now, let's see what the founders had to say about money, particularly continentals or paper money. One of the reasons why the Constitutional Convention was called in 1787 was that the money at that time, called the continentals, in 1 year went from 10 to 1 against the Spanish milled dollar to 1,000 to 1. So you can imagine the chaos that caused, inflating money then. You know, they didn't have a Federal Reserve system where all that excessive amount of paper was pulled off the market. So that meant that there was all kinds of paper out there. And people, you know, you carried in granny sacks. There was so much of it. And Congress, all they knew is they just printed it and paid bills with it. They thought, man, this is great. You know, just print it. That's all you have to do. You know, really money is abstract, right? It could be anything. You know, if we were in desert, some desert, you could use seashells. But if you were in Cape May, New Jersey, can you use a seashell? Right? So you can use anything. Indians used wampum. What were wampum? They were just beaded belts. Right? And even the early colonists used wampum with the Indians. And what would make one belt worth more than another belt?
More beads? More beads on it?
Well, not necessarily more beads. I would.
Wider the belt?
Sally? The artistic work, the labor involved. The labor that they put into it. So actually, your wealth is your labor that you put into things. And money only reflects that because it's precious. Everybody understand that? Money is precious, and that's why they only use gold and silver, because gold and silver has transcended civilizations. Civilizations have come and gone, but gold and silver, why is gold and silver so precious and always used for money? It has intrinsic value. It takes a lot to get it, but why is it the standard and always has been?
Can't destroy it.
It's rare. Who? Would you?
You can't destroy it.
You cannot destroy it. That's correct. You cannot destroy gold and silver. No matter how high you heat it or how cold it gets, it doesn't lose one iota of its properties. You cannot destroy gold and silver. That's why. That's why it transcends. Not only that, Lately, it has what? A value for what? That's right, being the best conductor of electricity, which is involved in all kinds of weapons. You can't get a better conductor of electricity than gold, silver, and platinum. Right? But they've always used gold and silver. It's precious. It's always been a precious metal. Not only that it's scarce, but it has all these other qualities and properties. So, you know, the founders understood this, and they understood the grief that they were having with the Continentals. I mean, crime was rampant. I think Washington wrote a letter to one of his friends, and he says he attributed all the crime and all the problem in the country to paper money. And if you really sit down and think about it, that's true. It's totally true. It causes all kinds of greed and everything else. And in fact, what we have here is a page from a book published by the federal government called Formation of the United States. This book has all the documents from the Mayflower Compact forward that brought about the creation of our country, its history. And here we have Madison's notes on the Constitutional Convention. He kept copious notes on the convention, everything that happened there. And these are his notes, which were published by the government. This book hasn't been published, I think, since 1968, I believe, was the last time it was published. And it has to be published by a resolution of Congress to print more. In fact, in 1984, I was home on furlough from the federal prison camp in Montgomery, Alabama, and one of the staff, well, I was dead 2 years down there for failure to file. Actually, when you max it out, it's 17 months and 5 days. And I was home on furlough. I had 2 furloughs while I was there. One year was 7 days, and the next year was 5 days. And the first time I come home, one of the staff members down there, he was the head of recreation in the camp. It was a black fellow by the name of Charlie Hudson. And Charlie was a Georgia cracker and one of the best patriots I ever knew. In fact, when I first was incarcerated down there, I wasn't there 2 days when a fellow came by and says, Charlie Hudson wants to see you in the rec shack. And I said, what the world does he want with me? I didn't even know who he was, you know. I said, who's he? And he says, well, he's the head of recreation here. So I said, all right. So I went on up to the rec shack, and I went to his office, and he says, come on in here. And he shut the door, and he says, I'm not letting you out of here till you tell me everything you know. So anyway, I had already had a copy of this book I purchased for myself, and when I come home on leave, Charlie really prevailed upon me to go over there and get one for him, you know. So anyway, my wife and I went over to the book depository on North Capitol Street, and we went in and purchased a copy for him, and the clerk happened to say to me, that's the last copy that the depository has. That's it. You got the last one. And I said, there's no more? He said, no. I said, you going to print some more? He says, no. That we can't print it till Congress passes a resolution ordering us to. And I said, oh, yeah? And I said, so Nancy and I, we went right over to the Capitol, which is about, what, four blocks from there. And we go to the House Ways and Means Committee. And the secretary was in there, and I said, we're here to lobby for the chairman of the committee to introduce a resolution to reprint Formation of the United States. And the woman says, what? And so I repeated it, and she says, well, they're never going to do that again. In fact, she laughed about that. Now, here we are on the eve of the 200th anniversary of the Constitution, and they said they would never print this again. And they haven't. They haven't. Yes, Vicki?
I think that's a good question to ask the candidates on the speak out night.
Why it's not published?
Say we want someone to
to publish this. It should have been widely available for the celebration, don't you think? Right? Well, maybe this page here talking about this committee meeting where a question was before the committee to be tried and answered. And before I get into this, the question, of course, is on money. It relates directly to Article 1, Section 8, Clause 5 that we just reviewed. And there's a little story behind this. From Maryland, there was 2 signers of the Declaration of Independence that were partners. One's name was Charles Carroll. In fact, this county's named after Charles Carroll. It's Carroll County. And my wife is a direct descendant of Charles Carroll. Of course, she comes from the side of the family that went through Catonsville. See, one of his daughters married a Caton. And she comes through that side of the family. And we have one of Charles Carroll's possessions in our house. And to show you which side of the family that was, I'll tell you, it's a chamber pot. All right. Now, also, his it's a small world, but his business partner's name was Samuel Chase. And it so happens that Ed Ellison's, a good friend of mine who was a member who lectures here, Ed's a JD, and he's also a talk show host and all. He's really did himself proud. But his wife is a direct descendant of Samuel Chase, Alice Ellison. And I always kind of rub Ed about this just a little bit. You know, the Chase name seems to have a stigma, doesn't it? What is the Chase name, doesn't it? You ever hear Chase Manhattan? Chase this, right? Chase that. and every time you hear Chase, what does it have to do with? Banking and money, right? Well, it just so happens that Samuel Chase and Charles Carroll were so divided over the issue of paper money that it destroyed their friendship and partnership. And neither one of them would leave to go to Philadelphia to the Constitutional Convention, feared the other one would clean him out. And that's true. Now, Charles Carroll was totally against paper money and fractional banking. Samuel Chase was all for it, as his descendants have bear true. Now, anyway, they sent 2 representatives for themselves. Charles Carroll sent Daniel Carroll, no relation, believe it or not, and Samuel Chase sent John Mercer. Now, I'm telling you this so I can save some face. Because when I show you how Maryland voted, I want you to know that Mercer said in this committee it wasn't Daniel Carroll. Okay? So now we'll review the notes of James Madison. Here he penned down that they were arguing about, and what was before the committee, in the original draft of the Constitution, it said in Article 1, Article 1, Section 8, Clause 5, the Congress shall have the power to coin money and emit bills. Now, the words "and emit bills" means to print paper money. Emitting bills is printing paper money. So here, there was a motion on the floor to strike from the original draft the 3 words "and emit bills" from back of Congress shall coin money, and then they want to strike these 3 words. Now, here's some of the argument that Mr. Madison recorded from the delegates to the convention. Mr. Ellsworth thought this a favorable moment to shut and bar the door against paper money. The mischiefs of the various experiments which had been made were now fresh in the public mind and had excited the disgust of all the respectable part of America. What's he talking about? The Continentals. He's talking about the Continentals, right? He says paper money can in no case be necessary, The power may do harm, never good. Paper money can never do good, he says. Look at Mr. Wilson. It will have a most salutary influence on the credit of the United States to remove the possibility of paper money. Why is that? Why did he say that would have a great influence on the credit of the United States? At that time, all the countries were on a coin standard. None of them used paper money. All of Europe used coins. That's always used for commerce. Look at Butler. He was most urgent in disarming the government of such power. And look at Reed. Thought the words, if not struck out, would be as alarming as the mark of the beast of Revelations. Was he correct? Was he correct? I don't know what some people feel, but I wrote an article, I guess at least 6 years ago in the Reasonable Action newsletter, that I actually believe that if we're here and the Social Security number is it. Because that number will be used in the beast in Brussels. It's going to be, if we let that go, it's going to be an international number. And it fits. It fits all the way. Langdon, look what Langdon said, had rather reject the whole plan than retain 3 words and emit bills. Just go home. Why are we here if we're going to leave here and have paper money? Well, that raises a question right now. If Article 1, Section 2, Clause 3 keeps the government out of debt, right? It balances the budget. Why do you think these modern-day shysters and politicians want to have a constitutional convention to pass an amendment to do the same thing? What's a good reason for them to want to do this? Well, there's a couple reasons, right? What would the reasons be? I didn't mean to cut you off.
I said they want to destroy the Constitution as we have it now.
Well, that's right, but how are they going to do this, right? There's a couple reasons for it, right? First reason is they're ignorant. They don't know the law. That's the first reason. When I was a young man, I used to think, man, these people running for office, the way they're remote, I thought they were something else. And then after the Bay of Pigs invasion, and I got involved in this hunt, because, during the Bay of Pigs invasion, I said, this isn't for real. I mean, I was a vet of naval aviation, and I knew that what happened at the Bay of Pigs could not happen by accident. It had to be planned. When men are leaving a ship to invade a country and hit the beaches, they don't give them the wrong ammunition for their guns so they can lay there and be rounded up. And they don't promise them air support and then take it away, not give it to them. You don't do these types of things if you're for real. And that started me looking. And at that time, I started getting involved in things. And I would go down there and meet these different Solons down in Annapolis and in Washington. And after a while, I got to thinking, my God, this man's running my country. I mean, I thought that I was ill-informed. I mean, I said, man, I became desperate. I became panicky. In fact, I was driving people away from me. They thought I was crazy. You just think back in 1963 and 64. People, thought you were crazy if you thought something was wrong with this country. This is the greatest country in the world. There's nothing wrong with this country. We go on perpetually. Nothing can happen here. The government's the best government in the world. Everybody thought I was crazy. I mean, we would have a meeting and nobody would show up. But any which way, as time went on, you find out these people are not bright at all. So first off, they're ignorant. That's number one. What is the second reason? By those who are not so ignorant and who are in the background pushing them. What's their motive? Power. All right? Well, if the Constitution doesn't need to be changed, why are they calling this convention?
No ground rules for convention.
Because the precedent was already set. When was the precedent set? For what? This convention right here. What was this convention called for? Does anybody know?
To fix the convention.
Fix the articles.
That's right. This convention was called, and every state sent delegates to make better the Confederacy, to fix the Articles of Confederation. They were not sent there to set up a new government, but they did. All through Madison's notes, nobody can find not one moment was spent in making better the Confederacy. As soon as they got there, they created a whole new government. That was the precedent. You know what that means? That means today, if they call a constitutional convention on the guise of doing something that's already there, then they can take away the whole thing. And you know what? In 1935, Rockefeller had one all drawn up, and it's been waiting there for the convention to be called. And if you read it, you'll find out, boy, you are in trouble. You better take it serious, believe me. And you know what? How close are they? 2 states. 2 states. Of course, we know that's not the end of it, because that's just the first round to call it. After that, it has to be ratified. Right? It has to go back through the states again. And then there's the question of some states called to rescind their call for the convention. Of course, they don't want to recognize that. Right? But that is another legal question. So hopefully, we will get back our desire to be responsible for ourselves and educate others and overcome this scheme to take away our freedoms and liberties. And what goes along with freedom and liberty?
Responsibility.
What else? What else?
Life and property.
Property. There is no property without liberty. You just become a tenant. You have no property without liberty. We were the first country in the history of the world to have allodial land titles. You know what that means? Allodial land titles, huh?
Absolute property rights.
Absolute property rights. That's correct. In fact, they called them freeholds. And the state of New Jersey, if you go wherever they record them, it's called freehold. That's where you record your property deeds, at the freehold. The first country in the history of the world where you had your own property free and clear. Just think about that. And that can all fly out the window just by being ignorant. Just by being ignorant. I mean, we gotta get the message out. Let me tell you something. Some people don't understand. We here at the headquarters just instituted a new project, which we called Bridging the Gap, where we have people who join us that don't understand what we're actually doing. And we send this letter out to explain this. They get we get a lot of people who join us because they're in trouble for no other reason. Now, we're not going to turn anybody away, and we're going to help everybody we can help. Don't get me wrong. But usually, they don't make the best member. Yeah, usually, the best member is a person who's a patriot, and he has burning in his heart the desire for liberty, and he comes in to do something for others so that we can all maintain our liberty. There's your member, your best member. And he'll give of his heart and soul and his pocketbook. But we have other people who come and they're in trouble. And they think that we can just write a letter and the IRS will go away. Well, let me tell you, nothing could be further from the truth. And we write and tell them this. when we tell them all we can do for them is argue the law. Beyond that, it is beyond us. So that's all we can do. And in most cases, we have to continually develop tactics and strategies. It's like a chess game you're playing. And we have people go, well, why don't you just tell them? I said, let me tell you, if all we had to do was tell them, you wouldn't be talking to me. It would have been long over. Just a matter of taking the law to the court, it would have been long gone. You know, that's a real novice when they tell you that. But anyway, people have to understand that. Your heart has to burn for liberty. You know, I can recall when I was a young police officer, I couldn't have been any more than 23 years old. And my partner who worked the radio car with me, he got a notice to be audited by the IRS. And he had an appointment, and it was during our working shift, and I had to take him up there. And I can recall the whole time I'm driving him up there thinking, you know, this is something else. Here I'm a cop, and I understand the principles of the law. I know that everybody's innocent, and you got to prove him guilty. But here this man, he has to go up there and prove his innocence. I'm thinking this, you know. And the whole time he was in there being audited, I'm sitting outside in the radio car, and I'm thinking, man, this is something else. I thought, if this is freedom, I know I surely don't want to live in Russia. Right? Not realizing at the time that we're the same as Nazi Germany. In fact, we've gone a little further than Nazi Germany. We started out the same as Nazi Germany back in the 30s. People don't realize that. They don't realize that. Hitler, well, first off, Bismarck started the Social Security scheme, and he couldn't carry it off. But Hitler and Roosevelt brought it in another way, and they did it together. It happened in Germany and here at the same time. Same scheme, same socialist scheme. Only Hitler was able to overturn the German Republic and take full control, where Roosevelt couldn't do that here. That's the only difference. But we've far exceeded what the Germans had during the war as far as bureaucracies and everything else. Do you realize how many agencies of the government can now confiscate property? Or they can't do it, I shouldn't say that, but how many are doing it as a matter of fact, but not as a matter of law? You not only have to worry about IRS doing it, you got to worry about HUD doing it now. I mean, if they have this what they call Section 8, right? Where they want to relocate welfare people to get them off the rolls. They're going to take them out of this welfare project that's all 10 years old and falling down. And they're going to move them out into the suburbs and put them in amongst suburbanites and so that they can change their ways. And they're going to subsidize their rent, right? Now, if you know that they're coming out your way and you file a suit in court, HUD can now fine you for that, for interfering in their program. And they not only can fine you, but they can take all your property, all your money. Did you know that? So in other words, the First Amendment no longer exists. You cannot put out flyers against it. You cannot file suit because they'll take your property. And you know, it's just totally unconstitutional. Totally unconstitutional. Well, why doesn't it end? Why? No, I don't know. Why doesn't it end? If it's totally unconstitutional, how can they do it? How can it be done?
Well, the people should take it to court, right?
By statute.
The people.
No. How? It's done by public policy. How can it be done? By taking it to court? That's how it's existing, because the judges are allowing it. That's the point I'm making. We cannot change anything as long as we have corruption in the courts. In this very document right here, the Formation of the United States, Madison's notes, it says right in Madison's notes that the framers, what they feared most to a challenge to the Republic was the sophistry of the courts. Now, what do they mean by sophistry of the courts? You know what they meant by that? Sophistry means phony. Sophisticated means phony. All right? And sophistry means that judges legislate law by slowly changing the law with their decisions, calling them case law. Everybody understand? And after a while, violating the Constitution becomes second nature to them. And they just protect one another. So what does it take to overcome this? Education of the public. Most people don't even understand that the courts are that bad, because they're isolated by the news media. And they don't really realize what goes on in these courts. So it's up to us to get the word out.
Most people also believe that the courts make the law.
Well, that's right. That's right. That's what happened. The reason why we seem to be getting the upper hand over the IRS in this raid was because their actual plans, it appears, as part of the conspiracy, was to indict me in Sioux Falls, South Dakota on December the 9th for conspiracy to defraud the government out of taxes, and then to raid us on the 10th, where the releases to the news media would be indicted, and then the raid. That gives them reason to raid, you see. Now, why wasn't I indicted? For the very same thing that you just said there. Because when I went there, I realized I had to get this jury to understand that I'm not a criminal. And the way I had to do that was I had to show them that the courts do not make law. Right? And what I did was I started, the grand jury is not like a regular court action. The grand jury's free for all. It's an open forum. There's no rules which you're bound by. So when I went out there, I armed myself with the affidavit of the special agent where he purged himself. And I brought evidence of his perjury. And I made a copy for each grand juror. And before I left, they each got a copy of that. That was one. That's because I had to build doubt in their mind to keep from being indicted. A juror most jurors are uninformed. When you go there, they believe you're guilty or you wouldn't come there. Right? I mean, they believe that. So you have to overcome this. It's a lot to overcome. The second thing I had to do is I had to show them why the IRS was after me. And that was because we're just about destroying the IRS, because when we represent people before the IRS, we raise the jurisdictional question that no citizen of the United States working in the states of the Union can be assessed by the IRS by the law. And they don't know how to handle that. They don't know what to do with that. And we go to an appeals officer, they don't know what the law is, and then we teach them this. It's causing a problem with inside the IRS, because we're teaching them the law. Now, what does that mean? Well, that means that how they reacted, they're trying to prevent me from representing people. Because they don't want their employees to understand what the law says. Right? That no citizen can be assessed. And it's clear in the law. So that's what I told those jurors out there. But before I could tell them that, I had to get the U.S. attorney to set the stage for me. So what I said to him, I said, isn't it true that if a law is written that the average man cannot understand it, it's void for vagueness? And he says, well, we'd liable to call it the Spirit. I said, I don't want to hear that. I said, I'm going to ask you again. Isn't it true that if a law is written and the average man cannot understand it, it's void for vagueness? After 3 times he said, yes, that's a principle of law. And that's what I was after. Then I showed the jury, for I brought my code book along, and I took them through the code, and I showed them out of the code that no citizen could be assessed by the IRS. The law is clear. It took me about an hour to take them through the code and show them this. Then it was thrown open to questions to the grand jurors. The first question coming was a woman way back in the corner, in the far right corner, and she stood up and she said, well, Mr. Cottonmire, isn't that really your interpretation of the law? I knew it was going to come. Why? Because they're brainwashed. They hear in the media the Supreme Court just made a law, and they believe this because they're told that over and over and over again. So I said, well, madam, you just heard just a little while ago this lawyer over here who happens to be your United States attorney, and he said that if a law is not written so the average person can understand it, it's void for vagueness. Is the code void? Then why am I here? Huh? Oh, I see. That U.S. attorney goes, huh? Right? See, that's why I didn't get indicted. If I hadn't went out there like that, let me tell you, that special agent went in there and primed them for 20 minutes before I got in and told them what a bad guy I was. And here I'm supposed to go out there to testify about one of my members, what I know about him, and all they asked me was about me. And all they asked me was about the fellowship. Don't you tell people not to file returns. I say, I never tell people not to file returns. By the way, I never do. All we do is tell you facts about the law. We're a First Amendment organization. We just tell you facts. What you do with those facts are your business. If you would ask me, do I know of any requirement for any citizen of the United States living and working in the States of the Union to file a return, I'll tell you I can't find it in the law. But I'm not telling you not to file a return. I'm telling you a fact about the law.
And how come there's so many people in jail?
Sir?
How come there's so many people in jail for evading taxes?
How many? Because of ignorance of the jury.
Not the attorneys.
Oh, no. No. The U.S. attorney knows full well that there is no tax crime for citizens. I went to jail. I didn't commit any crime. There is no crime. There's no crime for... The only crime could be for a citizen if he voluntarily makes a return and lies on it. That's evasion. But if you don't file it, there is no crime. They charge you with a penalty statute. A penalty statute that has no requirement in it, 7203. Anyone who willfully fails to file or defeat the tax. Well, it's a penalty. You shall be penalized by such and such. But they have to show the underlying statute that you violated to charge you with a penalty. And they can't, and they never do. There is none. When the people of the United States find that out, nobody will go to jail anymore. You see? You go there by the ignorance of the jury. And let me tell you, they select their juries very carefully. They make sure they're on the dole, and they make sure most of them are old and on Social Security, and they tell them he's threatening your livelihood. He is threatening your retirement. And they tell them that too. If I can show you transcript after transcript, and you can't find the law in there nowhere. The whole thing is a smokescreen, preying on the mindset and preying on their prejudice, because they won't be on the dole anymore if we get away with it. And every case is the same thing over and over again. Yes.
Another thing that preys on the mindset of the people is it's a myth that there are millions of people in jail for tax evasion.
Oh, yes. Well, Margaret Milner Richardson, who her husband is very famous now. You heard about her husband, haven't you? Everybody heard about her husband? Oh, my. I mean, it was in the Washington Post about a week ago. Her husband was parked in an alley outside a restaurant, and he would block the whole alley. There was not room to get by. And this lady lived up the street, and she cut through the alley to go pick up her husband, and she had her children with her from work. And she couldn't get through for his car. And she blew the horn and what have you, and nobody came out. So finally, she didn't want to leave her children alone. You know, in D.C., you don't do that. So anyway, finally, a parking valet came out, and she said, you know, she asked him, and all he did was cuss her out. But anyway, finally, she prevailed upon him, and 15, 20 minutes later, he went in to look for whoever owned the car, and it happened to be the Commissioner of Internal Revenue's husband. And he came out, and he started cussing the lady out. And then he says to her, he says, let me tell you something. My wife is the Commissioner of Internal Revenue, and I'm going to check you better had paid your taxes last year. Yeah, it was in the Washington Post. You know, she was appointed by Clinton, and she's Hillary's best friend. Does that tell you anything, right? But anyway, Margaret Milner Richardson, last year in November, spoke to a convention of enrolled agents in Las Vegas, Nevada. You know what the enrolled agents are? They're people who are in private practice that the IRS enroll to represent people before the IRS. They're in business. They're like a lawyer that can take you to the IRS and appeal or whatever. And she's out there pleading to them for help. Well, of course, they're together, right? Stands to reason they're together. One depends on the other. And she told them that there has to be every effort that can be made for compliance because 1 in 5 has stopped filing. 1 in 5 has stopped filing, she said, which was publicized and recorded. That. How many is 1 in 5?
30, 40 million?
40 million. 1 in 5 is 40 million.
Is that true?
I don't know. How do I know it's true? I'm quoting Margaret Milner Richardson.
Well, you have to wonder why she said it.
I know there's a lot of people stop filing. I don't know how many. I don't know. But she's asking for help. She's not speaking to Congress. If she was speaking to Congress, you could say she wants more money. Right? But she's telling these people here, you know, we got to beat the bushes and we got to get these people back in. Right? So you're right, Ace. You know what I mean? It is. It's coming apart at the seams. I've had a flyer since I drew up in 1982. And it offers $10,000 to anybody to prove me wrong. And since 1982, we've had 5 people attempt to collect the $10,000. 3 were lawyers, and 1 was a judge, and 2 were private citizens, and none of them collected. Because they didn't know what they just thought they knew what they were talking about. So we asked people to prove it wrong. I did this Gene Burns show in New York, and I told them the same thing. I said, I want you to go to the law library and prove me wrong what I'm saying. Take the time and go there and show where I'm wrong. Show me. Show me. I'm telling the IRS all the time, come on up here. We invite them in every Saturday. Come on in and show us. I've been on the radio telling them to come in here and show me where I'm wrong. If you think I'm wrong, come up and we'll both examine the law together. Right? So, last week, I got a phone call, and I answered, Mr. Cutmire, yes, my name's so-and-so, I live in New York City. Yes, sir. I heard you on the Gene Burns show. Yes, sir. He says, and I'm a law student at Columbia. I said, you are? He says, yes, sir, I am. And he says, and I took you up on your challenge, and I went to the law library to prove you wrong. And he said, I've been 3 weeks and I can't do it. He says, all I can do is prove you right. He says, I'm amazed. He says, I have my professor head whirling. He don't know what to make of all this. His professor doesn't know either. They don't know. But that's no, when we're getting this all the time. George, who's an attorney in Shreveport, Louisiana. In fact, George is handling part of this case for us on this raid. We have 2 cases filed, and he's handling one, I'm handling the other. And George told me, he said, the guy gave me the videotape, the one we made in 90, he gave it to me, and he says, here, prove the guy wrong. And he said, I watched the tape, and the more I watched it, he says, in fact, I told the guy, I said, that's no problem at all. And he said, the more I watched it, he said, the less I could do. He says, all I could do is say, you're right. And he said, in fact, you taught me more than 6 hours than what they taught me 4 years in law school. Out of that tape. Me had said that. He really admitted that, you see. And they don't know. They don't get the Constitution. All they do is they show them how to find the law, and they have all these court cases for them to look up to say what the court had to say about this and that. You know, one judge lies and the other one swears to it. that's what you wind up with. Anyway, we better get back to the talk, I think. I think we were somewhere in the Constitutional Convention of 1787, and what was the outcome of the vote to strike the 3 words? Was New Hampshire said yea, strike. Massachusetts said yea, strike. Connecticut said yea, strike. New Jersey, without excuse, said no. PA said yea, strike. Delaware said yea, strike. And Maryland, with excuse, said no. Virginia said yea, strike. North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia said yea, strike. So that's why we don't have paper money today. Right? Because they struck it from the Constitution of 1787. Is that correct? What can I say? Now, we examine Article 1, Section 10, Clause 1, which was authored by Roger Sherman and Mr. Wilson. And Roger Sherman said this would forever bar the government, the federal government, from using paper money. That's a profound statement. How this would forever bar them from using paper money. Let's examine and see what he's talking about. It says, no state shall coin money, admit bills of credit, make anything but gold and silver coin a tender in payment of debts. What does he mean by that? The state can't coin money, can it? No. Better tell Nevada, I think they're trying to coin money out there. Somebody better tell them that the Constitution says they can't do that. All right? Admit bills of credit. They can't print paper money either. Right? Make anything but gold and silver coin a tender in payment of that. What's tender mean?
Offer.
Offer. Tender means to offer. So the state must what? In paying its debt, it must what?
Gold and silver.
They must offer gold and silver. If they turn it down, then that's another thing. But if they have to offer it. Anybody here work for the state? Anybody here work for the state? Shall I ask 3 times? If you do work for the state, what can you demand in your pay envelope? Huh? You can demand gold and silver coin. Isn't that correct? Well, that's what the law says. You know, these courts, they like to say other things that are not there. In fact, they're doing it all the time. There's a code section in the Internal Revenue Code in Subtitle F, which is Administration and Procedures, it's Section 6065. And what 6065 says, it says all documents pertaining to the enforcement of the Internal Revenue Code shall be signed under penalty of perjury. And the courts like to say, well, that means for the taxpayers. But the word taxpayer is not in there. So if the word taxpayer is not in there and the court's saying it means the taxpayers, what does it mean about that code section? It's void for vagueness. Is that right? Now, what we did was we just engaged services of 2 PhDs in language. And we're now going to go to court with them and take affidavits from them as to what the words in the code section mean. Surely the court will accept such authorities as these people who are expert in the language, don't you think? Huh? They might even tell you what this means. They can tell the state what that means. Of course, you know, we can't, but they can, right? It means the state has to pay its bills in gold and silver coin. And that's exactly what it means. Well, how does this get back to Mr. Sherman when he said he would forever bar the door to paper money? What does that mean? Well, the state can't print paper money. It says that, right? But can the government?
It doesn't have any authority.
Well, they struck the authority from the Constitution. And what does the 10th Amendment say?
The right to reserve.
Right to
the
reserve
state.
for the state.
Well, it says more than that. What does the 10th Amendment say?
Any authority not enumerated to Congress is reserved to the states and the people.
It has to be enumerated within the Constitution or they don't have it. Is that right? Well, if the founders took it out of the original draft and it wasn't originally there, then it's not there, is it? So according to the 10th Amendment, they can't do anything like that. Well, what about how does that keep the federal government from printing it practically, not even considering the law? That's right. The government can, the direct tax, it has to be paid in gold and silver coin. That's correct. In fact, during the war between the states, notice what I said? Huh? During the war between the states, is that right? Okay, it wasn't a civil war, was it? No. During the war between the states, the government did lay a direct tax. And it was collected, and there was a county in Oregon that collected Lincoln greenbacks. What's a Lincoln greenback? Anybody know what a Lincoln greenback is?
Note of debt?
Mm-hmm.
Sure. Note of debt.
Yeah. The Lincoln greenback was the first paper money of the United States of America.
That was called a Continental? Is it a
No. The Continental was from the Confederacy. Right? The Lincoln greenback was the first paper money of the United States of America, the Republic, the Constitutional Republic. Well, how did that come to be? Anybody know how that came to be?
Emergency powers?
It came from an emergency, but it wasn't any emergency powers because there are no emergency powers that are in violation of the Constitution. They're not powers at all. They're violations of the law, and they're not violations of the law are not powers, right?
In this tape, we have shown that there are 2 classes of taxes, direct and indirect, and that direct taxes are paid by state governments, not individuals. We have also shown that the income tax is an indirect tax in the form of an excise, and that an excise tax is a tax imposed on the manufacture, sale, or consumption of a commodity, on corporate privilege, or on certain privileged occupations. We discussed Supreme Court decisions acknowledging that the income tax is an excise tax. In Madison's notes, we saw the intent of those who framed the Constitution and learned that the Constitution does not authorize either the federal government or state governments to print paper money. We examined Article 1, Section 10 of the Constitution that was authored by Roger Sherman to forever bar the door against paper money. We mentioned the powerful international banking interests that benefit from the use of paper money, and showed why the founders were so concerned about the banking interest's ability to influence judges and politicians. We learned that courts do not make law, but we also learned that judges often have political or financial reasons for subverting the intent of the law. And finally, we explained what every first-year law student learns in law school. A law that cannot be understood by someone of average intelligence is void for vagueness.